The arrival of the Black Death. How fast did it spread? The arrival of the Black Death in Europe during the 14th century marked the beginning of one of the most significant and rapid pandemics in recorded history. The disease, identified as a strain of the bacterium Yersinia pestis, is believed to have originated in Central Asia, where it spread among rodent populations and was carried by fleas. Through established trade routes, the infection moved westward, facilitated by the movement of goods, animals, and people. Historical records indicate that the Black Death reached the Crimean port city of Kaffa in 1346, where a Mongol siege introduced the disease to the area. From there, the plague spread to Europe via merchant ships traveling across the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The disease is generally believed to have arrived in Europe proper through the port of Messina in Sicily in October 1347. Once present in European coastal cities, the Black Death spread quickly along trade routes, aided by the regular movement of merchants, sailors, and travelers. Maritime trade played a central role in the transmission of the plague, with infected ships carrying the disease to major port cities including Genoa, Venice, and Marseille within a matter of weeks or months. From these initial coastal locations, the infection advanced inland, following roads, rivers, and overland trade networks. Contemporary reports suggest that the spread of the Black Death proceeded at varying speeds depending on geography, population density, and local conditions. In some regions, the disease advanced by as much as several kilometers per day, while in others, the rate of transmission slowed due to natural barriers, limited travel, or isolated communities. Throughout 1348, the plague moved rapidly through Italy, France, and the Iberian Peninsula, with significant outbreaks recorded in cities such as Florence, Paris, and Barcelona within months of the disease's initial arrival. By mid-1348, the infection had crossed into England, introduced via ports in the south, including Melcombe Regis. From there, the plague spread throughout the British Isles over the course of approximately 1 year. By 1349, the Black Death had reached Scotland, Ireland, and much of Scandinavia, including Norway and Sweden, primarily through maritime routes. Inland areas of Eastern Europe, including Poland and parts of the Baltic region, were affected somewhat later, though the precise timing and extent of outbreaks in these regions varied according to differing levels of connectivity and trade. The rapid spread of the disease was facilitated by the movement of both symptomatic and asymptomatic individuals, as well as by the transportation of infected goods and animals. The fleas and rats that carried Yersinia pestis thrived in human settlements, particularly in urban centers where sanitation was poor and populations lived in close quarters. Contemporary chroniclers describe the disease's progression across Europe as continuous, with few regions entirely spared, although some isolated communities experienced delayed outbreaks or avoided infection altogether due to geographical isolation or limited contact with trade networks. Estimates suggest that the Black Death spread across much of Europe within a period of approximately 4 to 5 years. By 1351, most of the continent had experienced significant outbreaks. The speed of the disease's transmission was unprecedented for the time, given the available means of transportation and communication. Factors contributing to the rapid spread included established commercial routes, high levels of mobility among merchants and soldiers, and the susceptibility of populations with limited immunity to such infections. The mortality rate was high, with entire communities suffering severe population losses within weeks of the disease's arrival. historical sources indicate that the social and economic disruptions caused by the rapid spread of the Black Death were immediate and extensive. Despite variations in speed across different regions, the general pattern of transmission demonstrates the efficiency with which the disease traveled across interconnected populations. By the mid-1350s, the pandemic had established itself as a defining event in European history. Having spread across vast distances in a relatively short period through a combination of biological, environmental, and human factors. Urban sanitation. Life in overcrowded, filthy medieval cities. Life in medieval cities was characterized by overcrowding, poor sanitation, and the constant presence of environmental waste. The general structure of urban settlements developed without systematic planning, resulting in narrow streets, densely packed buildings, and limited open spaces. Most cities were enclosed by defensive walls, which restricted expansion and contributed to high population densities within confined areas. The movement of people, animals, and goods occurred along streets that were often unpaved and uneven, making them prone to the accumulation of waste and debris. Residential structures were typically built close together, with upper floors extending over the streets below, further limiting space and ventilation. The lack of effective waste disposal systems created persistent hygiene challenges. Households relied on chamber pots and rudimentary latrines where available, though many residents simply emptied waste directly into the streets, alleys, or open drains. In some cities, regulations were introduced to manage waste disposal, but enforcement was inconsistent and largely ineffective. Animal waste added to the unsanitary conditions as livestock such as pigs, chickens, goats, and horses were commonly kept within city limits for food and transport purposes. Open markets and workshops contributed additional refuse, including food scraps, byproducts from tanning, butchering, and metalworking which accumulated in public areas. Water sources within medieval cities varied in quality and accessibility. Wells, public fountains, and rivers provided water for drinking, cooking, and cleaning, but contamination was widespread due to the proximity of waste disposal sites and the absence of proper sewage management. Some larger cities developed basic drainage systems in the form of open gutters or ditches designed to channel waste and rainwater away from populated areas, but these systems were prone to blockage and overflow, particularly during periods of heavy rainfall. The presence of waste and stagnant water created favorable conditions for the spread of disease and infestations of vermin. Rats, fleas, lice, and other pests thrived in these environments, contributing to the transmission of illnesses. Medical knowledge regarding sanitation was limited, and the connection between environmental conditions and disease was poorly understood. The prevailing belief attributed illness to bad air or miasmas, leading to superficial attempts at improving air quality through the use of aromatic herbs and incense, but without addressing the underlying sanitation problems. Overcrowding exacerbated the transmission of infectious diseases, with entire households often confined to small, poorly ventilated living spaces. Urban populations also suffered from food shortages and malnutrition, which weakened immune systems and increased vulnerability to illness. Religious and charitable institutions sometimes provided public latrines, bathhouses, and water sources, though access to these facilities was restricted by social status, location, and economic factors. Sanitation conditions varied between cities and regions. with wealthier urban centres occasionally implementing more organised waste management practices, though these remained rudimentary by modern standards. Efforts to improve urban sanitation were limited by technical knowledge, financial constraints, and the social acceptance of unsanitary conditions as a normal aspect of daily life. During periods of epidemic outbreaks, such as the Black Death, urban sanitation challenges became more pronounced, with mass burials and the accumulation of corpses adding to the environmental hazards. The lack of infrastructure to manage such crises contributed to the rapid spread of disease and high mortality rates. Despite the presence of governing authorities in medieval cities, comprehensive public health policies were largely absent, and sanitation concerns were addressed on an ad hoc basis. Seasonal changes further influenced hygiene conditions, with warmer months accelerating the decomposition of waste and colder periods limiting access to water sources for cleaning. The design and maintenance of streets, buildings, and public spaces reflected a limited understanding of urban sanitation, with little attention given to long-term health considerations. The persistence of these conditions across centuries illustrates the difficulties medieval societies faced in managing hygiene within rapidly growing urban populations. Overcrowding, inadequate waste disposal, contaminated water, and the prevalence of disease were defining features of life in medieval cities, shaping daily routines, health outcomes, and the overall living environment in ways that persisted until the gradual development of modern sanitation infrastructure in later historical periods. Waste management. Where did all the human and animal waste go? In medieval towns and cities, the management of human and animal waste was rudimentary, inconsistent, and often insufficient for the needs of the growing urban populations. The absence of advanced sewage systems and a general lack of public infrastructure meant that waste disposal largely depended on individual practices, communal arrangements, and basic environmental features. In private homes, human waste was typically collected in chamber pots, which were emptied either into cesspits, rudimentary latrines, or directly onto the streets and alleys. In buildings where latrines existed, these were often small enclosures built over pits or ditches. In wealthier households, some latrines connected to small drainage channels or cesspools, but these were prone to overflowing or required manual emptying. Cesspits, where available, would accumulate waste until they were cleaned, a task usually carried out by workers known as gong farmers. This labor was physically demanding and unpleasant, involving the removal of waste material for disposal outside city limits. In many cases, however, waste was simply discarded into nearby streets, contributing to unsanitary conditions within populated areas. Public streets and alleys functioned as informal waste disposal zones, where both human and animal waste accumulated alongside household refuse and industrial byproducts. Open drains or gutters, known in some regions as kennels, were designed to carry liquid waste away from buildings, but they often became clogged with debris. During periods of rainfall, these drains would overflow, spreading waste across the streets. Waste collection regulations were introduced in some cities, requiring residents to dispose of refuse away from main thoroughfares. But these rules were difficult to enforce and frequently ignored. Animal waste posed additional challenges, as livestock were commonly kept within city walls for food, transport, and labor purposes. Horses, oxen, pigs, goats, and poultry contributed to the constant accumulation of manure in public spaces. In some cities, pigs roamed freely, consuming refuse but also contributing their own waste to the environment. Stables, barns, and animal enclosures produced concentrated waste that was often piled in designated areas but not always removed promptly. Some of the animal waste was collected for agricultural use outside city boundaries, where it served as fertilizer for fields and crops. However, large quantities of manure remained within urban environments, particularly in densely populated districts. Waste disposal practices varied by region, available resources, and local governance structures. Rivers and waterways were commonly used as convenient waste disposal sites. Residents, businesses, and institutions would dump human waste, animal waste, and refuse into rivers, streams, and moats, contributing to water contamination and creating health risks. In coastal cities, waste was also discarded into the sea. Wells and fountains, which served as sources of drinking water, were frequently located near waste disposal sites, increasing the risk of waterborne illnesses. The presence of waste in close proximity to residential and commercial spaces facilitated the spread of diseases and pests. Rats, fleas, flies, and other vermin thrived in these environments, exacerbating public health challenges. The connection between waste accumulation and disease was not fully understood at the time, and public health policies remained limited in scope and effectiveness. Occasionally, municipal authorities organized waste removal efforts, such as hiring laborers to clean streets or transport waste outside city boundaries. Designated waste disposal sites, known as middens or dunghills, were established in some locations, providing communal areas for refuse collection. However, these sites were often located near populated areas, contributing to persistent environmental contamination. In some cases, waste was buried or burned, but such practices were irregular and did not significantly reduce overall waste levels. Seasonal variations also influenced waste management, as winter conditions could limit waste removal activities, while warmer months accelerated decomposition and intensified odors. The overall management of human and animal waste in medieval societies reflects the technological and organizational limitations of the period. Urban settlements continued to grow despite these sanitation challenges, with little advancement in waste management practices until the gradual development of modern sewer systems and public health initiatives in later centuries. The medieval understanding of disease. The medieval understanding of disease was shaped by a combination of classical medical theories, religious beliefs, and limited empirical observation. Medical knowledge during this period relied heavily on ancient authorities, particularly the works of Hippocrates and Galen, whose ideas dominated European medical thought for centuries. Central to this understanding was the theory of the four humours, which proposed that human health depended on the balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile within the body. Illness was believed to result from an imbalance or corruption of these humours, influenced by factors such as diet, environment, emotions, and lifestyle. Physicians diagnosed disease by examining the patient's appearance, bodily excretions, pulse, and other external signs, with treatment focused on restoring humoral balance through bloodletting, purging, dietary changes, and the administration of herbal remedies. Beyond humoral theory, the environment was considered an important determinant of health. The concept of miasma, or bad air, suggested that disease spread through foul smells and polluted air, particularly in urban areas with poor sanitation. As a result, efforts to prevent illness included improving ventilation, burning aromatic substances, and avoiding locations believed to harbour unhealthy air. contaminated water, waste accumulation, and stagnant air were recognized as harmful, though the precise mechanisms of disease transmission remained unknown. Religious explanations played a significant role in shaping medieval attitudes toward disease. Many people believed that illness represented divine punishment for sin or moral failings, both on an individual and collective level. Epidemics were often interpreted as a sign of God's displeasure, leading to acts of public penance, fasting, and prayer. Religious processions, pilgrimages, and other spiritual interventions were common responses to outbreaks of disease. Some believed that supernatural forces, such as demons or witches, could cause illness, though these explanations were more prevalent in certain regions and time periods. The Church exercised considerable influence over public health practices, promoting spiritual remedies alongside physical treatments. Hospitals, often established by religious institutions, provided care for the sick, though these facilities focused more on shelter and comfort than on curing disease. Monasteries sometimes maintained higher standards of cleanliness and medical practice, with monks trained in basic healing techniques based on classical texts. Despite these efforts, medieval medical knowledge remained limited by the absence of scientific experimentation, understanding of microbiology, and effective treatments for many common illnesses. The role of contagion in disease transmission was poorly understood, though some practitioners observed patterns suggesting person-to-person spread. Quarantine measures were occasionally implemented during severe outbreaks, particularly in port cities facing the arrival of ships suspected of carrying disease. However, such measures were inconsistent and often based on incomplete or inaccurate information. The arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century exposed the limitations of medieval medical theories and practices. Physicians struggled to explain or control the rapid spread and high mortality of the plague, with many relying on existing frameworks of humoral imbalance, miasma, or divine retribution to account for the devastation. The inadequacy of these explanations led to widespread fear, confusion, and social disruption. Over time, empirical observation and practical experience contributed to gradual improvements in the understanding of disease, though significant advancements did not occur until the early modern period with the development of germ theory and modern medical science. During the medieval period, however, the understanding of disease remained rooted in traditional theories, religious beliefs, and limited observational knowledge. Treatments focused on restoring bodily balance, avoiding harmful environments, and seeking spiritual intervention. Public health measures were fragmented and largely reactive, with little capacity to prevent or contain major outbreaks effectively. The persistence of these beliefs and practices reflects the broader limitations of medieval society in addressing health challenges shaped by constrained scientific knowledge, cultural norms, and the enduring influence of classical and religious thought on medical understanding. In addition to the prevailing medical and religious explanations, astrology played a significant role in the medieval understanding of disease. Many physicians and scholars believed that the positions and movements of celestial bodies could influence human health and the outbreak of illnesses. Personal hygiene practices, soap, washing, and grooming. Personal hygiene practices in the medieval period were shaped by a combination of cultural customs, environmental conditions, economic circumstances, and religious beliefs. The general approach to personal cleanliness was inconsistent and largely dependent on social status, geographic location, and access to resources. Soap was known and produced in various forms, though its quality, availability, and use varied considerably. Soap was typically made from a mixture of animal fats, ashes, and sometimes plant materials. In wealthier households and urban centers, soap production was more organized, with some regions, particularly in southern Europe, developing a reputation for producing higher quality soap using olive oil and other refined ingredients. However, soap was not universally used for daily washing, and its application was often limited by cost and availability. For many individuals, washing with plain water was the most common form of personal hygiene, especially in rural areas where access to soap and bathing facilities was restricted. Full-body bathing was practiced but occurred infrequently, influenced by seasonal factors, water availability, and cultural attitudes. In colder climates or during winter months, bathing was less common due to practical challenges in heating water. Public bathhouses provided access to bathing in urban areas, though their use varied based on local customs and religious regulations. Washing of the face, hands, and feet was more routinely practiced, especially before meals and religious observances, reflecting both practical hygiene and symbolic purity. Hair grooming and maintenance were also part of personal hygiene routines. Combs and brushes were used to manage hair, and head coverings, such as hoods, veils, or hats, were worn for both cleanliness and social reasons. Lice and other parasites were common, particularly among lower socio-economic groups, and various remedies including herbal washes and manual removal were employed to address infestations. Shaving and beard grooming were influenced by regional trends, religious guidelines, and occupational requirements. Monastic communities often required shaved heads or tonsures, while other men maintained facial hair based on personal or cultural preferences. Dental hygiene was limited by the absence of modern dental tools or toothpaste. People sometimes used cloths, twigs, or herbal mixtures to clean their teeth, though tooth decay and oral diseases were widespread. Perfumed oils, herbs, and scented materials were used by wealthier individuals to mask body odors, particularly when frequent washing was impractical. The use of linen undergarments played an important role in personal hygiene, as these garments absorbed sweat and could be washed more frequently than outer clothing. Changing linen was considered a form of cleanliness, even when full bathing was not possible. Clothing hygiene varied by social class, with wealthier individuals possessing multiple garments that allowed for more regular washing. Laundry was conducted in rivers, communal washhouses, or at home, depending on available resources. Religious beliefs significantly influenced personal hygiene practices. Cleanliness was sometimes associated with spiritual purity, though excessive attention to the body was discouraged by certain religious authorities who viewed it as vanity or a distraction from moral obligations. Pilgrims, ascetics, and others engaged in religious practices might forego regular washing as a sign of humility or devotion. Nevertheless, in some religious communities, structured routines for washing hands, faces, and other parts of the body were maintained. Despite these practices, overall hygiene standards remained limited by technological constraints, environmental conditions, and incomplete understanding of disease transmission. The presence of parasites, skin conditions, and infections was common across all social groups, though wealthier individuals generally had greater access to hygiene resources. Efforts to maintain personal cleanliness were often overshadowed by broader public health challenges, including contaminated water supplies, poor waste management, and overcrowded living conditions. Personal hygiene routines during the medieval period reflected practical necessity, cultural tradition, and available resources, providing only a partial defense against the health risks posed by unsanitary environments and limited medical knowledge. The gradual development of improved hygiene practices occurred over subsequent centuries, building on these early foundations. Plague doctors and their protective gear. Plague doctors were medical practitioners appointed to treat victims of the plague during outbreaks in Europe, particularly during the 17th century, though the image associated with them became widely recognized and symbolic of plague medicine in general. Their role was to attend to the sick, document the number of victims, and offer basic treatments. Although their effectiveness was limited by the prevailing medical knowledge of the time, plague doctors were often hired by municipalities or governing authorities, especially in urban areas severely affected by disease. Many of these doctors were poorly trained or lacked formal medical education, as qualified physicians frequently avoided areas suffering from outbreaks due to the high risk of infection. To provide some level of protection while carrying out their duties, plague doctors wore specialized protective clothing designed according to the miasma theory of disease, which suggested that illness spread through bad air or poisonous vapors. The most distinctive element of their gear was the mask with a long, bird-like beak, which was filled with aromatic substances such as herbs, spices, dried flowers, or vinegar-soaked materials. The purpose of the beak was to filter and purify the air that the doctor breathed, based on the belief that pleasant or strong scents could neutralize harmful miasmas. The mask also covered the entire face, with glass openings for the eyes, intended to provide further protection against contaminated air. In addition to the mask, plague doctors wore a long overcoat made from heavy fabric or waxed leather, covering the body from neck to ankle. This garment was designed to prevent contaminated droplets or particles from coming into contact with the skin or clothing underneath. The overcoat was often accompanied by gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat, all made from similar materials intended to create a barrier against potential infection. The hat also served as a symbol of the medical profession and helped to identify the wearer as a plague doctor. Some accounts mention the use of canes or wooden sticks carried by plague doctors, which allowed them to examine patients without direct physical contact. These sticks were also used to direct family members, inspect corpses, or maintain distance from crowds. The full outfit created a physical separation between the doctor and their surroundings, though it did not provide effective protection against the actual transmission of the plague, which was later understood to spread primarily through fleas carried by rats and, to a lesser extent, respiratory droplets from infected individuals. Despite its limitations, the protective gear became a recognizable feature of plague medicine and contributed to the public perception of plague doctors during epidemics. The use of aromatic substances, heavy garments, and physical barriers reflected the medical theories of the period, particularly the emphasis on miasmas as a source of disease. Plague doctors performed various duties, including treating patients with methods consistent with humoral theory, such as bloodletting, applying poultices, or recommending dietary changes. They also kept records of infections and deaths, assisted with quarantine enforcement, and sometimes provided testimony in legal matters concerning the plague. Their presence was both practical and symbolic, representing efforts by authorities to respond to outbreaks, though their ability to cure or contain the disease was minimal. The distinctive costume of plague doctors is most commonly associated with outbreaks in 17th century France and Italy, though the general concept of protective clothing during epidemics existed in earlier periods, including during the Black Death in the 14th century, albeit with less standardization. The image of the beaked mask and long overcoat has persisted in historical records and popular culture, symbolizing the fear, uncertainty, and limited medical capacity that characterized responses to plague outbreaks. While the protective gear worn by plague doctors reflected an incomplete understanding of disease, it illustrates the early attempts to apply preventive measures based on available knowledge. Over time, advancements in medical science, public health, and sanitation would lead to more effective approaches to disease prevention and treatment, though the historical image of the plague doctor remains as a reminder of the challenges faced during one of history's most devastating epidemics. Quarantine and isolation. Early public health measures. Quarantine and isolation were among the earliest forms of public health measures implemented in response to the spread of infectious diseases in medieval Europe. These practices developed gradually as communities attempted to limit the transmission of illnesses, particularly during outbreaks of the plague. The understanding of disease transmission during this period was based on incomplete knowledge, with prevailing theories focused on miasma, humoral imbalance, and divine punishment. Despite these limitations, practical observation of how disease spread between individuals and across communities led to the development of basic containment strategies. One of the earliest recorded uses of quarantine occurred in the 14th century in response to the Black Death, which devastated large portions of Europe. The term quarantine is derived from the Italian word quaranta, meaning 40, referring to the 40-day isolation period imposed on ships, people, and goods suspected of carrying disease. The practice originated in the port city of Dubrovnik, then known as Ragusa, where authorities required ships arriving from plague-affected areas to anchor offshore for 40 days before passengers and cargo could disembark. This measure aimed to prevent the introduction of disease into the city by allowing time for symptoms to appear in those who might be infected. Similar quarantine regulations were soon adopted by other ports and cities across Europe, particularly in regions with high levels of maritime trade. Quarantine was applied not only to ships, but also to overland travelers, goods, and even entire communities when outbreaks occurred. Infected households were sometimes sealed, with residents required to remain indoors for extended periods. Markings on doors or the placement of guards signaled that isolation was in effect, restricting movement and limiting contact with the broader population. Temporary plague hospitals, known as pest houses or lazarettos, were established in some cities to isolate and care for those afflicted with disease, though conditions in these facilities were often poor and survival rates low. The enforcement of quarantine and isolation measures varied by location, with local authorities, medical practitioners, and religious leaders all playing roles in implementing these strategies. Compliance with restrictions depended on social cooperation, the perceived severity of the outbreak, and the resources available to support isolated individuals. In some cases, non-compliance or escape from quarantine led to legal penalties. Though enforcement was not always consistent, the economic and social impact of quarantine was significant, affecting trade, travel, and daily life. Yet authorities often viewed these measures as necessary to protect public health. The success of quarantine and isolation in limiting disease transmission was mixed, as the true mechanisms of contagion were not understood, and other contributing factors, such as poor sanitation and the role of animal vectors, were largely overlooked. Nevertheless, the use of containment strategies reflected a practical response to observable patterns of disease spread, even within the constraints of medieval medical theory. Over time, the concept of quarantine became more formalized, with specific regulations, designated quarantine stations, and administrative procedures developed in major ports and cities. The practice extended beyond plague outbreaks to other infectious diseases, including leprosy and smallpox, though its application varied widely depending on local circumstances. Isolation of individuals with visible symptoms, such as skin lesions or respiratory distress, was a common approach to reducing exposure. Religious institutions sometimes supported quarantine measures by providing shelter, food, and care for isolated individuals, while also conducting public prayers and processions to seek divine intervention. Despite these efforts, limitations in medical knowledge and infrastructure reduced the overall effectiveness of early public health measures. Quarantine and isolation practices during the medieval period marked the beginning of organized responses to infectious disease, laying the groundwork for more systematic public health initiatives in later centuries. These early containment efforts demonstrated a recognition of the need to limit human contact during outbreaks, even without a clear understanding of microbial pathogens or the complex factors contributing to disease transmission. The use of quarantine and isolation reflected the gradual development of practical health measures based on observation, experience, and community cooperation within the broader historical context of medieval society. Clothing, fleas, and rats. Hygiene in textiles. Hygiene in textiles during the medieval period was limited by the available materials, environmental conditions, and the absence of systematic sanitation practices. Clothing was made primarily from wool, linen, and, for wealthier individuals, silk. These textiles provided necessary protection from the elements, but also served as environments where fleas, lice, and other parasites could thrive. Fleas were especially significant in the spread of disease, most notably the plague, as they acted as vectors carrying the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which infected human populations. Rats, particularly the black rat, were widespread in medieval towns, cities, and rural areas. These rodents frequently lived in close proximity to human settlements, attracted by food stores, refuse, and shelter within buildings. Rats carried fleas, which would feed on both animals and humans, creating pathways for the transmission of diseases. Clothing, especially when infrequently washed or stored in unsanitary conditions, contributed to this cycle by harboring fleas and lice. Regular laundering of garments was inconsistent and depended on access to water, soap, and washing facilities. Linen undergarments were more commonly washed, as they were worn next to the skin and absorbed sweat and body oils. Outer garments made from wool or heavier fabrics were cleaned less frequently due to the difficulty of washing and drying such materials. In wealthier households, clothing maintenance included brushing, airing, and occasional washing. But these practices were not universally applied across all social classes. Poorer populations often owned fewer garments, resulting in extended wear without adequate cleaning. The accumulation of dirt, body oils, and other organic materials in clothing provided favorable conditions for parasites. Infestations of fleas, lice, and mites were common, particularly among individuals living in crowded or impoverished conditions. Bedding, blankets, and other household textiles also contributed to the spread of parasites, as these items were often shared and washed infrequently. In some cases, households addressed infestations by boiling linens, exposing textiles to sunlight, or using herbal remedies believed to repel insects. However, the effectiveness of these methods was limited, and infestations remained widespread. Rats moved easily within settlements, accessing homes, food stores, and storage areas. Their presence was difficult to control, as urban waste accumulation and poor sanitation provided abundant resources for rodent populations. Rats were also transported inadvertently through trade routes, ships, and caravans, facilitating the spread of both fleas and disease across regions. Despite observable patterns linking rats, fleas, and illness, the precise mechanisms of disease transmission were not understood during the medieval period. As a result, public health measures focused primarily on controlling visible environmental conditions, such as waste disposal, rather than addressing the role of parasites or rodents. The connection between hygiene in textiles and overall health was not systematically recognized, although personal cleanliness and the management of clothing were acknowledged as important in reducing discomfort and the visible presence of parasites. In some religious communities and wealthier households, efforts to maintain textile hygiene included more regular washing of linens, storage in clean environments, and periodic replacement of heavily infested or damaged garments. Nevertheless, these practices were not widespread, and the majority of the population faced persistent challenges in maintaining clean, parasite-free clothing and bedding. The combination of poor textile hygiene, the prevalence of fleas and lice, and the widespread presence of rats contributed significantly to public health risks, particularly in densely populated urban centers. During outbreaks of plague and other infectious diseases, efforts to clean or destroy contaminated clothing were sometimes implemented, though such measures were limited by available resources and knowledge. Over time, advancements in textile production, sanitation, and public health gradually improved conditions, but during the medieval period, hygiene in clothing remained an ongoing challenge. The presence of fleas and rats, combined with irregular cleaning practices, contributed to the persistence of disease and discomfort within medieval society. The relationship between textiles, parasites, and health illustrates the broader limitations of hygiene practices in the period, shaped by environmental constraints, technological limitations, and incomplete understanding of disease transmission. The dead and disease. Burial practices during the Black Death. Burial practices during the Black Death were shaped by necessity, religious traditions, and the overwhelming scale of mortality that accompanied the plague. In the mid-14th century, as the Black Death spread rapidly across Europe, the death toll increased beyond the capacity of existing burial grounds, religious institutions, and communities to manage the remains of the deceased in accordance with established customs. Before the plague, burial practices typically involved interment in consecrated ground, often within churchyards or cemeteries affiliated with religious institutions. Funerals were conducted with religious rites performed by clergy, reflecting the belief that proper burial in holy ground was essential for the soul's passage to the afterlife. However, the Black Death produced mortality rates so high that these conventional practices became unsustainable. The rapid progression of the disease, combined with the risk of infection and social disruption, led to significant changes in how communities handled the dead. In many locations, individual burials were replaced by mass graves, also referred to as plague pits, where large numbers of bodies were interred together without individual markers or ceremonies. These mass graves were often dug hastily outside city walls, in open fields, or in designated plague cemeteries established to accommodate the growing number of victims. The physical labor required to dig such graves was considerable, and in many instances, local authorities employed laborers or conscripted individuals to perform the task. In some cases, carts were used to transport the dead from homes, streets, or hospitals to burial sites. Historical accounts describe bodies being collected and deposited into graves with minimal handling or ceremony due to the scale of the crisis and the fear of contagion. Religious services continued where possible, though many clergy were themselves affected by the plague, reducing the availability of formal rites. The rapid decomposition of bodies and the lack of adequate burial space contributed to unsanitary conditions, particularly in urban centers, where the density of the population made burial logistics more difficult. In some cities, temporary structures, such as charnel houses or ossuaries, were used to store remains before final interment. The speed at which communities were forced to adapt burial practices reflects both the severity of the Black Death and the limited resources available to manage the dead. In rural areas, where population density was lower, traditional burial practices persisted for a longer period, though even these regions experienced significant strain as the plague reached more isolated communities. Fear of the disease and the belief that the dead could spread infection influenced how bodies were handled, with some individuals avoiding contact altogether. Others adopted basic precautions, such as covering the deceased with cloth or attempting to disinfect bodies with aromatic substances. Despite these efforts, understanding of disease transmission remained limited, and burial practices were primarily shaped by immediate practical concerns. The Church played a role in adapting burial customs to the realities of the crisis, granting exceptions to standard practices and establishing new cemeteries where needed. Religious leaders continued to emphasize the importance of proper burial, even when individual graves and ceremonies were no longer feasible. Artistic and literary depictions from the period reflect the visibility of death and the changes in burial practices, with images of mass graves and skeletal figures becoming more common in cultural representations. Over time, as the immediate crisis subsided, communities made efforts to commemorate the dead, including the construction of memorials, the consecration of mass graves, and the reburial of remains where possible. The Black Death fundamentally altered burial practices across Europe, demonstrating the tension between religious tradition, public health concerns, and practical necessity during a period of unprecedented mortality. The reliance on mass graves, the suspension of individual funerals, and the adaptation of religious rites reflect how medieval society responded to the overwhelming impact of the plague, with limited resources and incomplete medical knowledge shaping the treatment of the dead during one of the most devastating pandemics in history. The impact of the plague on public health awareness. The impact of the plague on public health awareness during the medieval period was significant, though limited by the scientific knowledge and infrastructure available at the time. The outbreak of the Black Death in the mid-14th century exposed the vulnerabilities of European societies to widespread disease and highlighted the lack of organized public health measures. Prior to the plague, health concerns were addressed on an individual or local basis, with minimal coordination at the community or governmental level. The scale of mortality caused by the Black Death, along with its rapid transmission and high fatality rates, forced communities to adopt new strategies in an attempt to limit the spread of illness and manage the consequences of mass death. One of the most visible developments was the increased implementation of quarantine measures, particularly in port cities and regions with high volumes of trade. Authorities in places such as Venice, Genoa, and Dubrovnik introduced quarantine regulations that required ships, goods, and travelers arriving from infected areas to undergo periods of isolation before being allowed entry. The adoption of these measures demonstrated a growing recognition of the role human movement played in disease transmission, even though the biological mechanisms of the plague were not yet understood. Quarantine regulations represented an early form of public health intervention based on observation and practical necessity rather than scientific knowledge. The widespread mortality also led to more systematic efforts to manage the disposal of bodies and the containment of contaminated materials. Municipal authorities established new cemeteries outside city walls to accommodate the high number of deaths and reduce the risk of environmental contamination within urban centers. Mass graves were used to bury the dead more efficiently, though these practices were implemented with varying degrees of organization and oversight. The need to handle the dead quickly and limit exposure to infection contributed to a heightened awareness of the importance of sanitary conditions during epidemics. Public health awareness also increased through the publication of plague treatises and health guides, which provided advice on how to reduce the risk of infection. These texts were written by physicians, scholars, and medical practitioners, often drawing on classical medical theories and contemporary observations. Recommendations included avoiding crowds, improving personal hygiene, burning aromatic substances to purify the air, and limiting contact with those displaying symptoms. Though much of this advice was based on incorrect assumptions, such as the belief in miasmas as the primary cause of disease, the dissemination of health information reflected an increased concern for disease prevention at both individual and community levels. In addition to quarantine and sanitation efforts, the plague influenced the development of early health boards and administrative bodies responsible for coordinating responses to outbreaks. In some Italian city-states, officials known as plague commissioners or health magistrates were appointed to oversee quarantine enforcement, manage hospitals, and supervise waste removal. These early public health structures were limited in scope and effectiveness, but represented a shift toward organized responses to public health crises. The repeated recurrence of plague outbreaks over subsequent centuries reinforced the importance of these measures and contributed to the gradual evolution of public health practices. Religious institutions also played a role in shaping public health awareness, with clergy participating in care for the sick, organizing public prayers, and providing spiritual guidance during times of crisis. While religious responses were primarily focused on spiritual remedies, such as penance and prayer, they were often accompanied by practical measures, including the establishment of hospitals and care centers. These efforts, though constrained by limited medical knowledge, provided basic support for affected populations and contributed to broader community awareness of health risks. The cumulative experience of dealing with plague outbreaks created a foundation for later advancements in public health policy, infrastructure, and scientific inquiry. While medieval public health awareness remained incomplete and often driven by observation rather than empirical research, the impact of the plague marked a turning point in the recognition of the need for organized responses to disease outbreaks. The measures introduced during and after the Black Death reflected an emerging understanding of the importance of controlling movement, improving sanitation, and managing the consequences of mass illness, laying the groundwork for future developments in public health systems and medical knowledge. The role of barber surgeons and basic medical hygiene. Barber surgeons played an important role in providing basic medical care during the medieval period, especially in towns and cities where access to formally trained physicians was limited. Their responsibilities combined elements of grooming, minor surgical procedures, and basic medical treatments. Barber surgeons were distinct from university-trained physicians, who typically focused on theoretical medicine and diagnosis, while barber surgeons provided practical services that addressed immediate physical needs. The profession emerged from the tradition of barbers performing grooming tasks such as cutting hair, shaving beards, and trimming nails. Over time, barbers also assumed medical duties, particularly those involving minor surgical interventions. Common procedures carried out by barber surgeons included bloodletting, tooth extraction, lancing boils, cleaning wounds, setting broken bones, and performing amputations when necessary. Bloodletting was based on the widely accepted humoral theory of medicine, which held that illness resulted from imbalances in the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. By removing a quantity of blood from the body, barber surgeons aimed to restore balance and improve health. In addition to therapeutic bloodletting, barber surgeons also treated injuries sustained in daily life, such as cuts, fractures, and infections. They worked in shops, at fairs, or in military camps, offering their services to a wide range of individuals, including soldiers, merchants, and laborers. Despite their practical experience, barber surgeons were often regarded as occupying a lower status within the medical hierarchy compared to university-educated physicians or members of religious medical orders. Basic medical hygiene practices among barber surgeons were limited by the period's incomplete understanding of disease transmission and infection control. Tools such as razors, knives, and saws were used repeatedly on different patients, often with minimal cleaning between uses. Sterilization techniques were rudimentary or non-existent, and antiseptic knowledge had not yet been developed. Instruments might be rinsed with water or wiped clean with cloths, but thorough disinfection was not practiced. As a result, the risk of infection following medical procedures remained high. Wound cleaning and dressing involved the use of water, vinegar, wine, or herbal preparations, which could provide limited protection against infection but were not consistently effective. Bandages were made from linen or other available textiles, though cleanliness varied, and reuse of materials was common. The presence of dirt, parasites, and environmental contaminants further increased the likelihood of complications during recovery. In military contexts, barber surgeons provided essential care on the battlefield, treating injuries such as arrow wounds, fractures, and amputations. Their role was particularly valued during times of war, when rapid and practical medical intervention was necessary. Despite their lack of formal medical education, many barber surgeons developed considerable skill through experience, particularly in managing trauma and performing minor surgeries. Some cities and guilds regulated the practice of barber surgeons by requiring apprenticeships, examinations, or membership in professional associations. These organizations helped to maintain certain standards of practice, though they did not significantly advance medical hygiene. In some regions, barber surgeons worked under the supervision of physicians or collaborated with other healthcare providers, contributing to a basic level of medical service for the population. The coexistence of grooming services and medical procedures in the work of barber surgeons reflected the practical realities of medieval society, where the division between personal care and healthcare was less rigid than in later periods. Religious institutions occasionally employed barber surgeons to assist in hospitals or monasteries, where they performed minor surgeries and provided basic medical care to the sick and poor. In these settings, some attention was given to cleanliness, but overall hygiene standards remained limited by contemporary knowledge and resource constraints. The work of barber surgeons contributed to the availability of medical services, for those unable to afford or access the care of formally trained physicians. Their practical skills, despite being constrained by the era's limited understanding of hygiene and infection, addressed immediate health needs within communities. The role of barber surgeons represents an early form of accessible healthcare, characterized by a combination of grooming, minor medical intervention, and basic hygiene practices that reflected the broader limitations of medieval medicine. The smell of the plague, odors, perfumes, and air purifiers. During the period of the Black Death, the association between odors and disease became an important factor in the public response to the plague. The dominant medical theory of the time attributed illness to miasmas, which were believed to be harmful vapors or corrupted air carrying disease. Foul smells were considered indicators of contaminated environments, and the presence of unpleasant odors was thought to signify areas where illness was more likely to spread. The smell of the plague was frequently described in historical accounts as a combination of decomposing bodies, uncollected waste, stagnant water, and poor sanitation. Overcrowded cities, lack of systematic waste management, and the high number of deaths contributed to a significant deterioration in air quality, reinforcing the belief that bad smells were connected to the presence of disease. In response to these conditions, individuals and communities employed various methods intended to mask or counteract unpleasant odors, with the aim of purifying the air and protecting health. Perfumes, aromatic herbs, and other scented substances were widely used as part of these efforts. Wealthier individuals often carried small containers known as pomanders, which were filled with fragrant materials such as cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, rosemary, and other spices or herbs. These pomanders were worn around the neck, attached to belts, or held in hand, allowing individuals to inhale scented air and avoid exposure to miasmas. The use of perfumes and aromatic substances extended beyond personal accessories to homes and public spaces. In some households, herbs and flowers were placed in living areas to improve air quality, while in others, fires were burned with aromatic woods or incense to produce cleansing smoke. Religious institutions and municipal authorities occasionally organized public burnings of aromatic materials during plague outbreaks, with the intention of purifying the environment and reducing the risk of illness. Plague doctors, who were appointed to treat and examine the sick, wore distinctive protective clothing that included a mask with a long beak filled with aromatic substances. The beak was designed to filter the air the doctor inhaled, based on the belief that fragrant air offered protection against miasmas. Common materials placed in the beak included herbs, dried flowers, vinegar-soaked sponges, and strong-smelling resins. Though ineffective against the actual transmission of disease, these measures reflected contemporary understandings of health and prevention. In addition to perfumes and aromatic substances, other practices aimed at purifying the air were implemented. Windows were kept open when possible to improve ventilation, although fears of contaminated outside air sometimes led to their closure. Streets were occasionally cleaned, and waste was removed, though these efforts were irregular and insufficient to address the scale of environmental contamination. In cities where mortality was high, the smell of decomposing bodies in homes, churches, and mass graves created severe olfactory conditions, reinforcing public fears and influencing behavior. The use of vinegar, both for personal washing and as an air purifier, was also common. People believed that vinegar had cleansing properties that could neutralize harmful vapors. Items soaked in vinegar were carried or placed in living areas, while some individuals washed their hands, faces, or even entire bodies with vinegar solutions. In some locations, fires were lit in the streets, either with common wood or with aromatic materials, as part of efforts to cleanse the air. These practices were based on the prevailing medical and cultural understanding of the relationship between smells and health. Though they provided little real protection against the spread of the plague, which was transmitted primarily through fleas carried by rats and, in some cases, respiratory droplets. The persistence of strong, unpleasant odors during plague outbreaks had psychological effects as well, contributing to increased fear, social disruption, and changes in daily routines. People avoided certain areas, limited their movement, or fled cities altogether when possible. Over time, the connection between odors and disease influenced broader hygiene practices, encouraging attention to waste management, ventilation, and environmental conditions, though systematic improvements were slow to develop. The reliance on perfumes, aromatic substances, and basic air purifiers during the Black Death reflects the limitations of medieval public health strategies and the emphasis placed on sensory indicators of disease in the absence of scientific knowledge about microbial pathogens. Legacy of the Black Death. Did hygiene practices improve afterward? The legacy of the Black Death had a gradual and complex impact on hygiene practices in Europe, though immediate and widespread improvements were limited by the scientific knowledge and infrastructure available during the period. The Black Death, which peaked between 1347 and 1351, resulted in significant social, economic, and demographic changes, but its effect on hygiene was not uniform or immediate. The devastation caused by the plague created greater awareness of the relationship between environment, sanitation, and health. Although misconceptions about disease transmission persisted for centuries. In the aftermath of the Black Death, some cities and towns introduced more formal regulations concerning waste management, street cleaning, and the handling of the dead. Municipal authorities recognized the need for improved public cleanliness to reduce the risk of future outbreaks, even though the connection between poor hygiene and disease was still not scientifically understood. In certain urban centers, new ordinances were established to control the disposal of refuse, animal waste, and household garbage. Some communities expanded burial grounds and relocated cemeteries outside city walls to reduce the contamination of residential areas. However, these measures were inconsistent, and enforcement varied widely based on local governance and resources. Public health initiatives, such as quarantine stations and isolation facilities, became more structured in response to recurring outbreaks of plague and other infectious diseases. The development of quarantine policies, particularly in port cities, reflected an emerging understanding of the need to control movement and manage environmental risks. Nevertheless, personal hygiene practices among the general population changed slowly. Bathing habits remained irregular, influenced by climate, access to clean water, and cultural beliefs about the health effects of bathing. The fear that washing with hot water opened the pores and increased susceptibility to illness persisted in some areas, limiting improvements in regular bathing routines. The use of aromatic substances, perfumes, and herbs to cleanse the air became more widespread following the plague, reflecting ongoing concerns about miasmas and foul odors as sources of disease. In wealthier households and religious institutions, efforts to maintain cleaner living environments, including the laundering of linens and the use of herbal remedies to repel insects, became more common. Monastic communities, hospitals, and some charitable organizations adopted stricter hygiene routines for their members and patients contributing to localized improvements in cleanliness. However, for the majority of the rural and urban poor, practical limitations in resources and infrastructure meant that daily hygiene remained basic and largely unchanged. The repeated recurrence of plague outbreaks in the decades following the initial wave reinforced the importance of environmental management and public health measures, leading to more consistent efforts in some regions to improve urban cleanliness. The establishment of health boards, regulations concerning water supply protection, and waste removal contributed to the gradual development of more organized public health systems. These measures were unevenly implemented across Europe, with variations based on political structures, economic conditions, and cultural traditions. The legacy of the Black Death also influenced medical education and public health discourse, with greater emphasis placed on observation, record-keeping, and preventive strategies. Although the biological mechanisms of disease transmission were not yet understood, the collective experience of the plague encouraged communities to adopt practical responses based on patterns of disease spread. The role of barber surgeons, physicians, and public health officials became more prominent in managing outbreaks and advising on hygiene practices. Over time, these developments contributed to incremental improvements in sanitation and hygiene infrastructure, particularly in larger cities with greater administrative capacity. The influence of the Black Death on hygiene practices must be understood as part of a broader historical process, marked by slow adaptation, ongoing reliance on traditional beliefs, and gradual advancements in public health. The improvements that did occur were shaped by observation, necessity, and social responses to the consequences of high mortality, rather than by scientific breakthroughs, which would not emerge until later centuries. The state of medieval hygiene before the plague. In the period preceding the outbreak of the Black Death in the 14th century, the general state of hygiene across medieval Europe was characterized by limited knowledge of sanitation practices, basic personal cleanliness routines, and inconsistent approaches to public health. Most people lacked access to running water and advanced sanitation infrastructure, and the understanding of disease transmission remained rudimentary. Personal hygiene among the population varied by social class, geographical location, and prevailing cultural norms. In urban areas, water sources included wells, public fountains, and rivers, though contamination of these sources was common due to the proximity of waste disposal sites and the general lack of regulated sewage systems. Rural populations primarily depended on streams and wells, with little oversight regarding water purity. Bathing practices were influenced by both practical constraints and religious beliefs. Public bathhouses existed in many towns and cities, often functioning as communal spaces where individuals could wash. However, these facilities were not uniformly available, and their cleanliness varied. The use of soap, typically made from animal fats and ashes, was known but not widespread, and its quality differed significantly. In colder regions, or during harsh seasons, bathing frequency decreased considerably. Attitudes toward cleanliness were also shaped by religious doctrines, with some authorities promoting physical cleanliness as a reflection of spiritual purity, while others discouraged excessive concern with the body, viewing it as a distraction from religious obligations. Within domestic environments, floors were usually covered with straw or rushes, which were replaced infrequently and often accumulated waste, debris, and vermin. Sanitation within homes and communal living spaces was minimal by modern standards. Human and animal waste disposal practices lacked consistency, with chamber pots, cesspits, and rudimentary latrines serving the needs of households where available. In towns, Waste collection regulations existed in some locations, but enforcement was limited, resulting in the frequent presence of refuse in public spaces. Street cleaning was irregular, and open drains or ditches commonly carried waste away from dwellings, though these systems were prone to blockage and overflow. The prevalence of animals such as pigs, dogs, and horses within urban areas contributed to unsanitary conditions, with animal waste adding to the general accumulation of filth. Agricultural communities also contended with similar hygiene challenges, though lower population density mitigated some of the health risks associated with poor sanitation. Medical knowledge concerning the relationship between hygiene and health was restricted to theoretical frameworks based on humoral theory, in which imbalances in bodily fluids were believed to cause illness. Consequently, preventive health measures focused more on dietary regulation and environmental factors rather than systematic hygiene practices. Epidemics and diseases were frequently attributed to miasmas, or bad air, leading to occasional attempts to improve air quality through the burning of aromatic substances, though these efforts had little impact on actual disease prevention. Records indicate that outbreaks of diseases such as leprosy, smallpox, and other infectious conditions were common before the plague, though their connections to unsanitary environments were not clearly understood. Religious institutions, including monasteries and abbeys, sometimes maintained higher hygiene standards compared to the general population, with some providing structured access to washing facilities, latrines, and regulated food preparation areas. However, such practices were confined to specific locations and did not extend widely to secular society. Waste management in densely populated urban centers remained inadequate, contributing to chronic public health issues. The construction of paved streets, drainage systems, and covered sewers occurred sporadically and was limited to major cities, with the majority of settlements lacking such infrastructure. Seasonal variations also influenced hygiene conditions, as heavy rains or flooding could overwhelm drainage and sanitation arrangements, increasing the spread of waste and disease. Despite some isolated examples of public health initiatives, medieval societies as a whole did not possess the organizational structures or scientific understanding required to implement effective, widespread hygiene measures. Before the advent of the plague, European populations coexisted with a background of chronic illnesses, environmental contamination, and irregular personal hygiene routines, water sources, and contamination. In medieval Europe, access to clean and reliable water sources was inconsistent, and contamination of water supplies was widespread due to limited infrastructure and poor sanitation practices. The primary sources of water for medieval communities included rivers, streams, wells, springs, rainwater collection, and public fountains. Urban areas often relied on nearby rivers and streams to meet their daily water needs, though the proximity of these sources to waste disposal sites made contamination common. In many towns and cities, residents collected water directly from rivers for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and industrial activities, such as tanning or brewing. However, these same rivers frequently served as open sewers, with human waste, animal waste, refuse, and industrial byproducts regularly discharged into the water. The lack of separation between drinking water sources and waste disposal sites contributed to the spread of waterborne illnesses. Wells were a significant source of water in many settlements, particularly in areas without direct access to rivers or streams. These wells were often dug by hand and lined with stone or wood to reduce the risk of collapse. While wells could provide relatively clean water if properly constructed and maintained, contamination was still common due to their location near latrines, cesspits, animal enclosures, or refuse piles. In densely populated areas, the groundwater was especially vulnerable to pollution, as waste seeped into the soil and entered the water table. Some wealthier households and religious institutions had access to private wells, which could reduce exposure to contaminated public sources, though maintenance challenges remained. Public fountains, supplied by aqueducts, springs or wells, provided water to urban residents in some larger towns and cities. These fountains were intended to offer more reliable access to clean water, but contamination risks persisted, particularly when waste disposal practices were poorly regulated. In some cities, aqueduct systems dating back to Roman times remained in use, delivering water from distant sources to urban populations. However, many of these systems fell into disrepair during the medieval period, limiting their effectiveness. In rural areas, streams, springs, and rainwater collection were common water sources, but these too faced contamination risks. Agricultural runoff, animal waste, and the disposal of household refuse near water sources compromised water quality. Rainwater was sometimes collected in barrels or cisterns, though storage conditions and exposure to environmental pollutants affected its safety. Understanding of waterborne diseases was limited, with most people unaware of the connection between contaminated water and illness. Instead, disease outbreaks were often attributed to supernatural causes, bad air, or divine punishment. Preventive measures were sporadic and rarely systematic. Some regulations attempted to protect water sources, such as prohibitions against washing clothes, slaughtering animals, or dumping waste near wells and fountains, but enforcement was inconsistent. In many cases, water contaminated with human or animal waste remained the primary source for daily consumption, contributing to the spread of illnesses such as dysentery, cholera, and other gastrointestinal infections. Religious institutions sometimes maintained higher standards of water management, with monasteries and abbeys constructing controlled water supplies for their communities. These systems included covered wells, enclosed fountains, and basic drainage networks designed to reduce contamination risks. However, such practices were limited in scope and largely confined to specific locations. In urban centers, the accumulation of waste in streets, drains, and open spaces increased the likelihood of water contamination, especially during periods of heavy rainfall or flooding. Seasonal changes also influenced water quality, with stagnant water during warmer months providing breeding grounds for pests and disease vectors. Winter conditions could disrupt access to water supplies, leading to increased reliance on stored or less reliable sources. Despite the challenges, medieval communities continued to depend on these contaminated water sources, with little advancement in water purification techniques or systematic sanitation practices. Boiling water was known as a method to improve safety, but this was not widely practiced due to fuel costs and general unawareness of its health benefits. The persistent exposure to contaminated water contributed to poor health outcomes and recurrent disease outbreaks across medieval Europe. It was not until the later development of modern sanitation infrastructure, including piped water systems and effective sewage management, that the widespread problem of water contamination began to be addressed systematically. Public baths and their role in medieval hygiene. Public baths played a limited but notable role in medieval hygiene, providing individuals with access to bathing facilities in urban centres where private washing arrangements were often unavailable. These establishments existed in many towns and cities across Europe. although their prevalence and accessibility varied by region, time period, and local customs. The tradition of public bathing was inherited from earlier Roman practices, though the scale and sophistication of Roman bathhouses were generally not maintained during the medieval period. Public baths were typically modest structures, consisting of wooden or stone buildings equipped with heated water, bathing tubs, and sometimes steam rooms. Water for the baths was supplied through wells, nearby rivers, springs, or aqueduct systems where available. Though the quality of the water varied significantly, heating was usually provided by wood-burning stoves or fireplaces, with hot water mixed with cold to achieve a suitable temperature. Public baths were used by individuals of various social classes, though fees were often required for entry, limiting access for the poorest residents. Bathing facilities served both hygiene and social functions, as they provided a space for washing the body, grooming, and social interaction. Men and women generally bathed separately, though mixed bathing occurred in some locations depending on local customs and regulations. The frequency of bathing varied according to personal preference, economic circumstances, seasonal factors, and religious beliefs. In colder regions or during winter months, bathing was less common due to practical challenges and the cost of heating water. Soap, typically made from animal fats and ashes, was used in some bathhouses, though its quality and availability differed by location. Religious attitudes toward public bathing influenced its popularity and accessibility. Some religious authorities promoted cleanliness as a reflection of spiritual purity, while others expressed concerns about immorality, idleness, or disease transmission associated with communal bathing. Consequently, the reputation and regulation of public baths fluctuated over time. In certain regions, public baths were associated with health benefits, and physicians sometimes recommended bathing to prevent illness or alleviate specific conditions. However, medical understanding of hygiene and disease remained limited, and the role of bathing in preventing infection was poorly understood. In some cities, bathhouses were regulated by local authorities to ensure cleanliness, manage fees, and prevent inappropriate behavior, though enforcement was inconsistent. Overcrowding, limited water circulation, and inadequate cleaning practices within some public baths contributed to hygiene challenges rather than resolving them. Water was not always changed frequently, and shared bathing spaces increased the risk of spreading skin infections, lice, and other communicable conditions. Despite these limitations, public baths remained one of the few accessible means for individuals to clean themselves, particularly for urban populations lacking private facilities. In rural areas, public baths were less common, and people relied on rivers, streams, or domestic arrangements for washing. Over time, changing social attitudes, economic factors, and public health concerns contributed to the decline of public baths in some regions, particularly following outbreaks of plague and other epidemics. Authorities sometimes closed bathhouses during disease outbreaks due to fears of contamination, though the actual effectiveness of such measures was limited. By the late medieval period, the popularity of public bathing had declined in some parts of Europe, replaced by increasing emphasis on dry hygiene practices, such as the use of linen garments to absorb sweat and the application of scented substances to mask body odor. Nonetheless, public baths persisted in certain areas, especially where cultural or religious traditions favored bathing. The role of public baths in medieval hygiene reflects the broader limitations and inconsistencies in sanitation practices during the period. They provided a partial solution to the challenges of personal cleanliness within crowded and unsanitary urban environments, but were not sufficient to address the overall hygiene needs of medieval populations. The eventual decline of public baths coincided with shifts in medical theory, social norms, and the development of more advanced sanitation infrastructure in later centuries. Until those changes occurred, public baths represented an important, though imperfect, component of daily life and hygiene for many people living in medieval European cities. The role of religion in hygiene practices. Religion played a significant role in shaping hygiene practices during the medieval period, influencing both individual behavior and communal attitudes towards cleanliness. The dominant religious authority in Europe at the time was the Christian Church, which provided guidance on many aspects of daily life, including matters related to the body, cleanliness, and health. Religious teachings often associated physical cleanliness with spiritual purity, though the interpretation and emphasis on hygiene varied among different communities, monastic orders, and regions. Within monastic environments, routine washing was integrated into daily practices, with specific times designated for washing hands, faces, and feet. Monasteries and abbeys often maintained washing facilities, latrines, and structured sanitation arrangements, which provided higher standards of cleanliness compared to the general population. Religious texts occasionally referred to the importance of washing, particularly in preparation for prayer, communal meals, or participation in religious ceremonies. However, excessive concern with physical appearance or cleanliness was discouraged by some religious authorities, as it was seen as a distraction from spiritual obligations or a sign of vanity. Ascetic practices within certain religious groups included the deliberate rejection of personal hygiene as an expression of humility, devotion, or detachment from worldly concerns. Individuals such as hermits, pilgrims, or members of specific monastic orders sometimes refrained from bathing or grooming as a demonstration of piety. Religious festivals, pilgrimages, and gatherings often brought large numbers of people together, which increased hygiene challenges and sometimes contributed to the spread of disease, though these events were viewed as essential expressions of faith. Religious institutions were also responsible for the establishment of hospitals, charitable care centers, and hospices, where hygiene practices were more systematically maintained compared to secular environments. These facilities provided care for the sick, poor, and travelers, with structured routines for washing, changing linens, and maintaining basic sanitation. Nonetheless, understanding of disease prevention within these institutions remained limited by the broader medical knowledge of the period. The connection between hygiene and morality was evident in certain religious practices, including ritual washing, fasting, and abstinence, which were believed to purify both the body and the soul. Water held symbolic significance in Christianity, most notably in the sacrament of baptism, which represented spiritual cleansing and rebirth. This symbolism reinforced the association between water, purity, and health, though practical applications of hygiene based on religious beliefs varied widely. During periods of disease outbreaks, such as the Black Death, religious responses often included acts of public penance, prayer, and processions, rather than systematic hygiene interventions. Illness was frequently interpreted as a punishment from God, and efforts to address disease focused on spiritual rather than physical remedies. While some religious authorities acknowledged the importance of cleanliness, widespread public health measures based on hygiene were rare and inconsistent. Regulations concerning burial practices, waste disposal, and the location of latrines occasionally reflected religious influence, as these matters were seen to impact both public health and moral order. Religious teachings also shaped attitudes toward bathing and the use of public bathhouses. In some regions, bathhouses were regarded as acceptable spaces for maintaining cleanliness, while in others, they were viewed with suspicion due to associations with immoral behavior or disease transmission. The regulation or closure of bathhouses during epidemics reflected both religious and public health concerns, though these measures were often implemented with limited understanding of disease prevention. Religious beliefs also influenced responses to contaminated water sources, with some communities viewing the use of holy wells, springs, or blessed water as protective against illness. Pilgrimage sites associated with miraculous healing attracted individuals seeking relief from disease, though these gatherings sometimes contributed to the spread of infection. Overall, the role of religion in hygiene practices during the medieval period reflected a complex interaction between spiritual beliefs, cultural traditions, and limited scientific knowledge. Religious institutions provided some of the most organized hygiene arrangements within monastic and charitable settings, while broader public hygiene practices were shaped by varying interpretations of religious teachings. The fear of water. Did people stop bathing during the Black Plague? During the period of the Black Plague in the 14th century, widespread fear, uncertainty, and confusion influenced many aspects of daily life, including hygiene practices such as bathing. The understanding of disease transmission at the time was based on incomplete medical knowledge, with prevailing theories centered on the concepts of miasma, humoral imbalance, and divine punishment. The miasma theory, which attributed illness to bad or corrupted air, played a significant role in shaping attitudes toward bathing during the plague. Many people believed that water, especially warm water, opened the pores of the skin, making the body more susceptible to the harmful air that was thought to carry disease. As a result, there was a gradual decline in the practice of regular bathing during outbreaks of plague. Some individuals and communities reduced or entirely avoided bathing out of fear that washing the body would increase vulnerability to infection. This cautious approach to bathing was reinforced by advice from certain physicians and medical authorities who recommended limiting exposure to water, particularly hot water, during times of widespread illness. Medical texts and plague treatises of the period sometimes advised against bathing, arguing that open pores created pathways for contaminated air and vapors to enter the body. Instead, people were encouraged to keep the skin covered with clothing and to use linen garments to absorb sweat and bodily oils as an alternative to frequent washing. Perfumes, aromatic herbs, and scented oils were also used to mask body odors and were believed to offer protection by counteracting the effects of miasma. These practices were more accessible to wealthier individuals who could afford such items, while lower social classes had fewer options. Public bathhouses, which had been a feature of urban life in parts of Europe, were sometimes closed during plague outbreaks due to fears that communal bathing increased the risk of contagion. Concerns over crowded spaces, shared water, and the potential spread of disease led authorities in some regions to restrict or prohibit the operation of bathhouses temporarily. However, the fear of water and reduction in bathing was not universal. Hygiene practices during the Black Plague varied by location, social status, and personal belief. Some individuals continued to bathe, particularly in areas where local customs or climate made washing an established part of daily routines. In regions with strong religious traditions associating cleanliness with spiritual purity, bathing persisted to some extent, although often with increased caution. Monastic communities and charitable institutions sometimes maintained washing facilities, though these were not always accessible to the general population. In rural areas, where population density was lower, concerns about public bathing facilities were less pronounced, though access to clean water remained inconsistent. The fear of water during the Black Plague reflected broader anxieties about the unknown nature of the disease and the limited effectiveness of available medical treatments. With no understanding of bacteria, viruses, or fleas as vectors of plague transmission, people relied on theories based on observable conditions, such as foul smells, corrupted air, and environmental factors. The avoidance of bathing became one of many preventive behaviors adopted during outbreaks, alongside the use of protective clothing, the burning of incense, and social distancing measures such as quarantine. It is important to note that even before the Black Plague, regular full-body bathing was not universally practiced across medieval Europe due to limitations in infrastructure, water availability, and seasonal conditions. The outbreak of plague amplified existing concerns about personal hygiene rather than introducing entirely new behaviors. Over time, as outbreaks of plague continued to recur, attitudes toward bathing and hygiene evolved, though the fear of water during epidemics persisted in some regions well into later centuries. The association between bathing, open pores, and susceptibility to disease remained part of medical advice for an extended period, gradually diminishing as scientific understanding of disease transmission improved. The decline in public bathing during the Black Plague illustrates how limited knowledge and fear influenced hygiene practices, contributing to the broader public health challenges faced by medieval societies during one of the most devastating pandemics in European history. Hygiene in the countryside versus the cities. Hygiene in the countryside and the cities during the medieval period differed significantly due to population density, available resources, infrastructure, and environmental conditions. Urban centers were characterized by overcrowding, poor sanitation, and limited space for effective waste disposal, while rural communities experienced lower population density, more open land, and different challenges related to hygiene management. In medieval cities, narrow streets, closely packed buildings, and limited access to clean water contributed to widespread sanitation problems. Waste disposal was irregular, with human and animal waste often discarded into streets, open drains, or nearby water sources. The accumulation of refuse, contaminated water supplies, and the constant presence of livestock created an environment conducive to disease and the spread of parasites. Public bathhouses provided some access to washing facilities, but their availability varied, and concerns about hygiene, disease transmission, and moral conduct sometimes led to their closure, especially during periods of epidemic outbreaks. In contrast, rural populations lived in smaller, more dispersed settlements where households were often separated by fields, forests, or other natural barriers. The lower concentration of people reduced the immediate impact of poor hygiene practices, though challenges remained. Access to fresh water in the countryside was generally more reliable, with wells, streams, and springs providing water for drinking, cooking, and washing. However, contamination still occurred due to proximity to livestock, inadequate waste disposal, and limited understanding of waterborne disease transmission. In agricultural communities, Livestock were kept in close proximity to homes for food production and labor, contributing to the presence of animal waste near living spaces. Households in rural areas managed personal hygiene with available resources, including washing with water from local sources and laundering linens when possible. Full-body bathing was less frequent, influenced by seasonal changes, water availability, and cultural norms. Soap was used in some areas, though its production and use were limited by economic constraints and access to raw materials. Rural households often relied on simple hygiene practices, such as changing linen garments, brushing off outer clothing, and using herbal remedies to manage lice or skin conditions. In cities, textile hygiene was more challenging due to overcrowding and irregular laundry facilities. Shared living spaces, common bedding, and infrequent washing contributed to the spread of fleas, lice, and other parasites. Urban waste management was inconsistent, with refuse often piling up in public spaces, attracting rats and other vermin. This environment facilitated the transmission of diseases, particularly during outbreaks of plague or other epidemics. In comparison, the countryside's lower population density and greater distance between households reduced the spread of contagious diseases, though outbreaks still occurred, especially when trade or travel brought infection to isolated communities. Religious institutions played a role in hygiene practices in both rural and urban settings, with monasteries and churches sometimes maintaining higher standards of cleanliness and sanitation. Monastic communities often had structured routines for washing, waste management, and food preparation, providing a contrast to the general population's inconsistent practices. Public health measures in cities included attempts to regulate waste disposal, clean streets, and manage contaminated water sources, though enforcement varied, and the effectiveness of these measures was limited by the absence of advanced infrastructure. Rural areas, with fewer formal regulations, relied on individual households to manage hygiene, resulting in varying standards based on personal circumstances, local resources, and community traditions. Both urban and rural populations faced challenges related to parasites, skin infections, and other hygiene-related health issues, though the specific risks differed according to environmental conditions. The countryside offered more space, cleaner air, and greater access to uncontaminated water in some regions, while cities provided communal facilities that could improve hygiene for those with access. Despite these differences, overall hygiene standards during the medieval period remained limited across both environments, constrained by technological limitations, incomplete medical knowledge, and cultural attitudes. The distinction between hygiene in the countryside and the cities reflects the broader conditions of medieval society, where environmental factors, resource availability, and social organization shaped daily hygiene practices within the limitations of the period. Hygiene superstitions and folk remedies. Hygiene superstitions and folk remedies played a significant role in daily life during the medieval period, reflecting the limited medical knowledge and the influence of cultural beliefs on health practices. In the absence of scientific understanding of disease transmission, people often turned to superstitions, traditional knowledge, and remedies passed down through generations to manage personal hygiene and prevent illness. Many of these practices were based on symbolic beliefs, environmental observations, or religious customs rather than empirical evidence. Superstitions concerning cleanliness and disease prevention included the belief that certain objects or actions could protect individuals from illness. People carried amulets, charms, or herbs believed to possess protective properties. Common materials used for this purpose included garlic, onions, and specific herbs thought to repel disease. These items were sometimes worn around the neck, attached to clothing, or placed in homes to ward off harmful influences. Bathing practices were also influenced by superstition. It was believed in some regions that excessive bathing, especially with hot water, could weaken the body by opening the pores and making individuals more vulnerable to disease. This belief became particularly prominent during outbreaks of plague, contributing to a decline in regular bathing in certain communities. At the same time, washing hands, faces, and feet with water or herbal infusions was seen as a way to maintain basic cleanliness, though the frequency and thoroughness of such practices varied by location, season, and social status. Folk remedies for hygiene and illness prevention often included the use of plants, minerals, and animal products thought to possess healing or cleansing properties. Herbal infusions, salves, and poultices were applied to the skin to treat rashes, wounds, or infections. Common ingredients included sage, rosemary, thyme, and lavender, which were believed to have purifying effects. Some households used vinegar as a cleaning agent for the body or living spaces, based on the belief that its strong smell could counteract harmful miasmas or corrupted air. Vinegar was also used to rinse wounds, though the effectiveness of this practice was inconsistent. The use of smoke and aromatic substances to cleanse living spaces reflected the widespread belief in the harmful nature of bad air. Burning herbs, incense, or specific types of wood was thought to purify the environment and reduce the risk of illness. These practices were observed both in private homes and public spaces, especially during periods of disease outbreaks. Folk beliefs also connected certain physical characteristics or behaviors to cleanliness and health. For example, wearing linen undergarments was seen as a form of hygiene, as linen was thought to absorb sweat and bodily oils, keeping the body cleaner. Changing linen regularly was recommended when possible, though access to multiple sets of clothing was limited for poorer individuals. In some communities, it was believed that carrying specific stones, crystals, or religious relics could protect against disease, with these items sometimes incorporated into hygiene routines or placed near beds and windows. Superstitions surrounding the prevention of lice, fleas, and other parasites included the use of herbal sachets, oils, and powders, although these methods had limited effectiveness. In rural areas, folk remedies were often based on local knowledge of plants and natural resources, with community healers, herbalists, and midwives providing guidance on hygiene and illness prevention. These individuals played an important role in preserving and transmitting traditional knowledge, even though the scientific basis for many of their recommendations was limited or absent. Some folk remedies also involved ritual actions, prayers, or blessings intended to protect health and maintain cleanliness, reflecting the intersection of hygiene practices with religious and cultural traditions. Despite the limitations of these superstitions and remedies, they provided individuals with a sense of agency and control over their health in a period when effective medical treatments were scarce. The reliance on hygiene superstitions and folk remedies continued for centuries, gradually evolving as scientific knowledge advanced and more systematic approaches to hygiene and public health were developed. During the medieval period, however, these practices remained an essential aspect of daily life and reflected the broader cultural, religious, and environmental factors that shaped medieval health and hygiene beliefs.